simple life in my 20s. I worked full-time at a grocery store in the high desert of Southern California. The pay was sufficient to cover costs of schooling, vehicle maintenance, and the small homesteader cabin I rented at the top of the mountain. On my days off, I rock climbed, biked, and tried to keep up with the local church's bluegrass band, picking and thumping, as I struggled to find chords on my new guitar. My evenings often wound down with a strong coffee out on the deck of my cabin, where I would watch the distant lights of Apple Valley twinkle to life in the dusk. I wasn't opposed to long-term relationships, but I was certainly content living on my own. If I had any sort of social life, it usually evolved from a church meeting or the market, and typically went no further than a day hike or neighborhood barbecue with several friends in attendance. That is, until I met Lucian. One afternoon I was at work, standing atop a stepladder, stocking sauces on an upper shelf. A young man walked into the grocery store with an older woman and two younger boys. The older woman and young man began comparing microwavable dinners in the freezer section. They appeared to be looking for a particular brand, so I placed the cardboard box of unstocked product on my shoulder and descended the ladder to assist them. "Better watch your step," the young man said, and flashed a wide smile followed with a wink. I politely chuckled, then went over and addressed the older woman. "Is there something I can help you find?" "Oh, I'm looking for the dinners with chicken and orange sauce. I have a coupon for buy one get one free," she replied. Noticing the empty section in the freezer, I offered to look in the back for more product. I returned a few minutes later with an unopened case of frozen orange chicken. The woman and two younger boys were gone, but her son was standing there waiting for me. "Oh, did she change her mind?" I asked. "Mom just went to get in line. I told her I'd bring the dinners up if you had them. We need 4. I sliced open the case with a box cutter, removed 4 dinners, and handed them over. "I'll take a 5th one if you want to come by after work and join us." It was a sad cliché flirtation, but endearing at the same time. Another polite laugh. "What's your name?" I replied. "Lucian." "Huh, Lucian," I repeated. "Nice to meet you. Why don't we ask your mom if she's okay with it?" I carried the dinners to the check stand, where Lucian's mother and 2 younger brothers were taking groceries from the cart and placing them on the conveyor belt. When I mentioned her eldest son's invitation, her response was kind and welcoming. Dinner would be at 7. After that first dinner, Lucian and I continued to see each other. We hiked, watched movies, attended church, and even went bungee jumping together. During the bungee jumping expedition, one of the other jumpers took our picture. Lucian stood behind me, with his arms around my waist and his chin resting on my shoulder, flashing that perfect white smile. I tacked the picture into my refrigerator with a magnet, next to another picture of us riding out on the dry lake beds. This was shaping up to be something special. In addition to our outdoor activities and occasional date night, we also spent a lot of time with Lucian's mother and brothers. I enjoyed his family's company and grew to be protective of his younger brothers, much as an older sibling would. Everything seemed to be going well, perhaps too well, when Lucian decided to invite me over for Bram Stoker's Dracula with his family. This is when the first seed of uneasiness was planted. We had just finished dinner, and were getting comfortable in the living room when Lucian went through the house and turned off all the lights, just setting the mood for a horror movie, I assumed. He sat on the floor next to his brothers, while his mother and I sat on the couch. The movie was one might expect: vampires and gore. I didn't particularly care for it, but I wasn't necessarily bothered by it either. Not until this one scene, where a baby is offered up as sacrifice to the female vampires, or vampiresses, I suppose they're called. Lucian began to laugh, hysterically, then imitated feeding on an infant like the vampires were. His face, lit by the light of a television, looked menacing as he clicked his teeth and smacked his lips. It was disturbing, so much so the four of us were silent, dumbfounded, as Lucian threw his head back and laughed again before returning his attention to the movie. I was speechless. Not that what he did was unforgivably offensive, but because it was sudden, startling even, and completely out of character from the man I had been dating for 2 months. On one of our hikes in the San Bernardino Mountains, Lucian confided in me about his former drug addiction. He had gotten clean after his mother paid for rehab, and he'd moved in with her to help raise his 2 younger brothers as a way of thanking her. And relocating to the high desert, Lucian was leaving his drug connections, former lifestyle, and a long-term girlfriend behind in Riverside. It was another seed of uneasiness, but it also helped me understand some of his infrequent and strange behavior. I didn't really believe he was completely clean, but I didn't think he was heavily dependent either. I thought maybe he was a recreational user. I wanted to encourage him to get established and stay on the straight and narrow. One of the ways I did this was by helping him find employment. One evening, I sat with Lucian at his mother's kitchen table and assisted him in writing a resume. He turned to me with impassioned eyes and said, "God sure broke the mold when he made you." I stacked the pages of his resume and placed them neatly in a file folder. These types of compliments were becoming frequent and tiresome, and I'd begun dismissing them with an affectionate, quick kiss on the cheek and a request to get back to the task at hand. He didn't like the fact that his compliments weren't reciprocated, or that I didn't fall under his spell. His sweet disposition soon melted, and he began making strange noises like an animal rooting around in the dirt, tracking scent. Regardless of his past drug use, inappropriate humor, and animal-like responses, Lucian was eventually hired as part of an overnight freight crew. Not having his own transportation, I would often drive him to work when his mother wasn't available. One late night, when I arrived at the house to pick him up for a graveyard shift, I noticed his younger brother looked ill. He was curled on the couch and hardly acknowledged me when I said hello. I asked Lucian about it, but he hurried me out the door with a promise to fill me in during the drive. As I pulled onto the dark desert road, I asked, "So, what's going on with your brother?" Lucian paused before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. "He couldn't sleep." He looked at me with his signature smile, relishing the fact that he had answers that he wouldn't readily give. "Okay, is that it? Is he all right?" I asked, sensing there was something more. I looked straight ahead at the empty highway and waited for an answer. Silence. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Lucian staring at me. The dashboard lights coated the side of his face in a pale blue light, and glinted off a row of perfect white teeth. Well, maybe he didn't sleep because I was thrashing on the floor all night and it kept him up. He settled back in his seat and looked out the passenger window. You were thrashing? Why? Because the devil himself came into our bedroom last night and tried to take me away again. But I wouldn't go without a fight. Lucian then laughed, a high-pitched sort of wheeze, and looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I figured this was some sort of teasing. Lucian knew I attended church and routinely read my Bible. The scare tactic was juvenile and a waste of time. I wasn't frightened. I was annoyed. I pulled into the industrial parking lot, and Lucian got out with his jacket and soda in hand. Mom will pick me up tomorrow. He winked before crossing the parking lot and walking through the warehouse door. As Lucian's strange comments and behavior became more frequent, I gradually distanced myself. The only reason I hadn't completely ended our relationship was partly because my fondness of his mother and brothers, the youngest of whom confirmed the night-long wrestle with the devil. I also wasn't convinced there was any real problem, despite the intuitive gnawing in my gut. I'd been through a lot at this point in my life, and Lucian's antics weren't as overtly troublesome as some of my past experiences. Still, when he asked if he could come by my cabin after I got off work, I told him I was closing and had an early shift the following day. The truth, however, was I got off work 2 hours before closing and didn't start work until 11 the next morning. But I didn't want Lucian's company. I didn't even want to talk to him on the phone. All I wanted to do was eat a quick meal, shower, and go to bed. There was a sliver of orange on the horizon when I clocked out at the grocery store and walked to my truck. A telltale sign that longer days were coming. Summer was around the corner, and I was eager to get back to mountain biking and spending time up in Big Bear at my grandfather's dock. These were the thoughts on my mind as I slowed my vehicle and eased onto the dirt road leading to my remote cabin. I clicked on the high beams and dropped the truck into a lower gear to crawl across the ruts created from the last hard rain as I turned up the incline to my home. The headlights fell across a figure standing on my deck. It was Lucian, hunched over with his hands buried in his sweatshirt pocket, looking directly into my high beams. I parked the truck and shut off the engine, wanting to avoid having to explain why I was home 2 hours earlier than I said I would be. I got out of the truck and asked how he had gotten to my house. Lucian lived 12 miles away and still didn't have his own vehicle. I walked. His expression was deadpan, and his voice had a coldness about it. I decided to take the offensive. Lucian, I told you tonight wasn't a good night to visit. I've got an early morning tomorrow. Come on, get in the truck and I'll take you home. It was a long 12 miles back to his house. I kept the truck running when I dropped him at the front door. From his porch, he turned and looked at me, as though he had more to say, but I drove away before he could utter a single word. As I drove back across the pitch-dark desert, a part of me wondered if I'd somehow see Lucian again, leaning against my front door when I got home. I was relieved when my headlights lit the face of a dark cabin with an empty deck. I ended our relationship the next day. It was an amicable split. I said we needed to separate for a while, and Lucian said he understood. There was a fleeting sense of disappointment, as one would experience with any failed relationship. But I felt an even stronger desire to get back to the independent person I was before. Several weeks passed without seeing Lucian, his mother, or his brothers. I wondered if the family had moved or if Lucian had possibly gone back to Riverside. The more time passed, the less I thought about them. It was a little before 9 at night, and I was getting ready to work an overnight shift at the grocery store. I was just pouring a thermos of coffee when something heavy crashed onto my roof. I trembled uncontrollably, spilling some of the coffee down the thermos and onto the kitchen counter. It was eerily quiet. All I heard was my heart beating forcefully against my chest. I set the pot down and stepped into the living room to listen. At the opening of my rustic rock fireplace, suddenly there were heavy footfalls and a dragging sound across the roof. I ran back into the kitchen and shut off all the lights, locked the deadbolt, and picked up the phone to call my distant neighbor. I told him of my situation, and he said to stay inside with the door locked and the lights out. He would be there shortly. I drove to the grocery store after my neighbor left and worked through the night. Our crew was just finishing up when the store opened. Lucian's mom and youngest brother walked into the market and selected a cart. Seeing me, the mother hurried over to give me a hug and asked me how I was doing. I told her that it was great to see her and asked about the boys. She leaned in and said in a lowered voice, "Lucian's gone back to Riverside." I was afraid he might. I sympathized. She slowly shook her head and then looked directly at me. "I love my son, but I care about you too. And I'm so grateful that you got away from him. He's back with his old girlfriend and I know he's going to kill her." Her words shocked me. Not so much that Lucian would murder someone, but that his own mother would state it so matter-of-factly. I was certain that would be the end of it. Lucian was gone and I had finally moved on. A year later, I married my best friend from the military. He was stationed in England at the time, and until I could wrap up my affairs in the States, I would be staying in California. While on one of his extended leaves, my husband stayed with me at my homesteader's cabin. It was a bitterly cold night. The winds roared from the mountain peaks and blew harshly across the desert floor. I was getting ready to get in the shower while my husband went outside to get more firewood. I had the water running and was about to get undressed when there was an urgent pounding on the bathroom door. Startled, I threw the door open. "What?" I snapped. My husband pushed past me and shut off the water. He inspected the window inside the shower stall. It was open a crack. He shut and locked it. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" "When I went out to get firewood, I saw something move in the shadows at the side of the house. It was a man with his face pressed up against the bathroom window." My body went cold. "What? What did you do?" I yelled at him. He took one look at me and ran off toward the railroad tracks. "Really? Did you get a good look at him?" It was white guy, medium build, dark hair, I don't know, 5'10" maybe. My husband stood guard outside while I showered. Then we sat beside the fire sharing a cup of hot tea. We talked about my living alone in such a remote area and what I had left to do before flying to England. It was in the early morning hours when we finally drifted off to sleep. I went to work the next day and mentioned the bathroom window incident to a friend of mine. Neither of us could think of anyone in this small, high-desert town that quite fit that description. When my lunch break rolled around, my husband stopped by to spend it with me. We were walking down the grocery aisle toward the front of the store when we encountered Lucian and his family. At this point, it had been well over a year since I had seen him. and several months since my conversation with his mother. We embraced briefly before I asked how long he would be in town. "Oh, I decided to move back. I got in from Riverside yesterday." His family seemed excited to have him home, but I secretly wondered if they would be safe with him. I introduced my husband and Lucian shook his hand, congratulating him on our recent marriage. It was slightly uncomfortable, but both men handled it well. When we parted ways, I turned to my husband and said, "That's the ex-boyfriend I told you about, the one that behaved so strangely." My husband looked back at the storefront as we got in the truck. "Yeah, well, he's also the guy that was at your bathroom window last night." I'm now in my 50s, and I haven't heard from nor seen Lucian since that day my husband shook his hand. Lucian still occasionally haunts my memories. I wonder if he's alive, dead, whether he turned his life around or eventually did kill someone. It's been so long since I last laid eyes on him. I wouldn't know him if we were face to face. That is, of course, unless he smiled.